You're listening to The Academy Is with the phrase that pays. You are tuning in to the voice of your college on 88.1 FM WVYC. I'm your host, Keelan Tollinger, your host for the next hour from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. I'm sorry. But thank you for joining me this afternoon on In the Studio this Friday, February the 8th. 2019, as we've got the second full week of classes under our belts, done and in the books now. So at this point, we're all kind of locked into our class choices now, but there's a rhythm to the workload that hopefully you've picked up by now. A routine for how much a typical assignment needs, basically. But going back to that polar vortex from last week, though, I mean, that thing is just gone. The average high this week had to be around like the upper 40s to the mid 50s. Now it's sitting at about 45 degrees, some blustery winds. I'll fill you in a little bit more on that during the weather check in 15 minutes. But still, I mean, Tuesday afternoon, the front door to my apartment was open and the fans were on, the heat was turned down. There's barely a pile of snow on the ground anymore. And it really makes you think about how like having the climate virtually swap in some regions. Like there were 100-degree changes in other parts of the country compared to this week and the last. But what that does to like animal hibernation patterns, the way trees are going to be budding their leaves, and that unpredictability, I think, can really throw a lot of things off, especially because we aren't out of the woods yet with snowfall, I think. There's been like a direct hit from a winter storm every spring semester that I've been here. And until I see those 6 inches of precipitation or more in March and the college closes for 2-3 days, I'm not convinced we've had winter yet. But no matter what the weather, the only place that is already making a killing is that Starbucks in Humanities. So a little while ago, they swapped out a pair of parking spots by the Creek Crossing Bridge. I think they're the spots where the Zip cars used to be, so instead of renting a car for a day, those spots are empty now, so Starbucks customers could be parked for a maximum of 15 minutes. And maybe that makes sense if you're a West Campus resident, you want to run over for a coffee, since you can't park in the faculty spaces that are adjacent to them. The commuter lots across the stream aren't available, and neither are the spots meant for main campus residents, so the parking regulations are pretty strict, and you can take advantage of those new traffic spots. I swear now that like people don't even have to like drive in, like they don't have to drive to the restaurant on South Queen Street anymore, and that's let them like double or triple their caffeine intake in a single day. It is just like spoiling some people here, and at the same time like draining their wallets as well. But they honestly do a good job of creating a space for students to go and hang out there. I mean, legitimately when the morning rush is finished and everyone would rather stop by the dining hall instead, the lounge area is enough for several groups of friends to talk or do homework together. I think it's money well spent from the college. By the way, don't forget that you can get caught up to what you might have missed last week by going online to youtube.com and searching In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger. First thing that'll pop up is a channel with all of my past shows, which you can go through on your own time. I briefly discussed my thoughts on the government shutdown, the repeat winner for the Australian Open, the numbers behind those rentable electric scooter accidents as well, and a vision for the future called artificial photosynthesis. It was a decently busy show, nothing too earth-shattering, but for this edition, there are plenty of issues to discuss. So York College's president has responded to an advertising gaffe that I'm still trying to wrap my head around myself. I'll share what it looks like and what some of the reactions to it were. But Wednesday night, the college had a fantastic lecture about a difficult time in York City's past that I really wasn't aware of. So you'll hear about that. The delayed State of the Union address on Tuesday night as well. Have to briefly go over that. And maybe you're still trying to wake up from that lackluster Super Bowl. That, yeah, won't be the most enthralling thing to talk about, but I'm more interested in some of the ads that ran. But first, we'll get some music underway for the hour, starting with the Postal Service and their song "The District Sleeps Alone Tonight." You're listening to the voice of your college on 88.1 FM WVYC, and I'll be back in a few. The Postal Service with "The District Sleeps Alone Tonight" here on 88.1 FM WVYC. I'm your host, Keelan Tollinger. So, the first news that I want to get into this afternoon broke early into the weekend about some promotional material that your college made for the nearby minor league baseball team here in the city. This is the York Revolution. So long story short, it was pointed out by a fellow student on Twitter that an existing photograph taken from about a year ago had turned up again at this stadium with some changes to it. On the left-hand side of this banner, there's an arrangement of 8 students lined up and leaning over like a gray fence. It's only really from their elbows to the top of their heads. In the new version put up at the Rev Stadium, a Caucasian male and female had their heads photoshopped out for an Asian American male and a Muslim female with her hair covered in a hijab. At first, it's kind of like a so what reaction. What's the big deal? I mean, to me, if I looked at that poster in the stadium with the Go Revs message along the bottom, the YCP logo in the corner, the From Day One slogan, it's not obvious to me. Like, I wouldn't have known otherwise that the original photo shoot with another white male and female and it even like exists in the first place. So it wasn't a messy or a hasty edit by any means, but now that this was pointed out that the effort was photoshopped in, I just feel like it was kind of a mistake on the college's part for trying to fix their image in this way. Now there's other things to unpack a lot about the circumstances here. So the local Fox 43 news station ran a story on it last weekend and interviewed one of the alumni who posed for the original photo in 2018. Actually, they talked to her inside the Fox TV studio because she's actually a member of the station's production team, which is kind of a funny coincidence. But her name was Karina Garcia, and she said yes, a photographer approached her and asked if she'd be a part of this promo. She agreed. But now that she spotted the edit and went back to this photographer, she was told that the college officials wanted more diversity in the shot. So, in Karina Garcia's words, they had to rush to fix the problem. Your college's social media team responded to the students who first brought this up on Twitter and confirmed that really the motives to this switch were to, quote, reflect the diversity of students who live and learn at York College. All those included are York College students. In an effort to reinforce inclusivity, we attempt to ensure that all students are represented and welcome. But it was after an article was published in the national journal Inside Higher Ed, they picked up the story and just torched the effort with a headline like, when colleges seek diversity through Photoshop. More response was needed from the college, and President Pamela Gunter Smith, in an email statement on Monday, followed up and said that in no way was this meant to falsely misrepresent our diversity at YCP. We wanted to celebrate the range of student ethnicity and show that we are an inclusive institution. Dr. GS also wrote that we're not as diverse in number as we would like to be, and we should have achieved the message of the billboard differently and certainly authentically. And we will ensure that's the case in the future. But let's take a quick break from the story for just a minute to get you the first weather check of the afternoon. But to go back inside this Inside Higher Ed article, it really seems to be like a recurring thing that they observed, that colleges and universities have done this kind of strategy and representation before. In admission booklets and websites all the way back to 2001, their first example, when they showed a University of Wisconsin information book with a lazy Photoshop of an African-American male in the corner of this sea of white students cheering at a game. Like, sometimes the person of color ratio in some of these promotional materials, like the photographs they use, is sometimes higher than what percentage is in the actual student body. So to be more specific on that, there's a 2008 study selected that looked at hundreds of different view books and brochures from random schools around the country. And the portrayed amount of black students in these brochures was around 12.4%. When the actual attendance at these schools selected, their brochures were at about 7.9%. So off by only about 4.5, but still, there's a disparity. Like, there's a gap, like a facade to it almost, when it comes to inclusion. And though many schools that I can hope are being wise about their transparency and representation, the best way to put it is like, doomed if you pretend to do, doomed if you don't. And of course you want to appear inclusive to the minority students who are selecting a higher ed institution. It's how you make them feel comfortable and welcome. But this is definitely a campus with a population that is a majority white. I believe there was like even a question for Dr. GS when my co-host and I interviewed her in the past about how we become more diverse. And yeah, I mean, for like, I'll be honest right now that I think one of the biggest barriers to getting a healthy variety of like different ethnicities to become York College students is really the price of tuition. Because like for the families, in an economic sense, that might not be able to readily afford the cost of a private college like this one, it's hard to become a member. And diversity really should be in the makeup of the population to begin with, and not just the face of your advertising. And I wish I understood the first step to a solution to all this, but I mean, really, it's kind of out of reach for me with my perspective. But just to reiterate, I don't think there's anything objectionable about having this banner try to include as many different ethnicities as possible. But in the future, the first attempt doing so has to be correct so the admissions department doesn't have to try and fake it with Photoshop. And I'm not too sure what most of the student body thinks, but included in the email from the president earlier this week was an opportunity to get in contact with the Office of Communications and share your thoughts as to how the college learns from this. And I hope if you felt passionate enough about this issue, you filled out the form and scheduled a meeting to sit down with the officials and start the discussion. And I don't know the status on the banner at the Rev Stadium. I think it still might be up there. I think it would probably be smart if they took it down by now. But those are pretty much all of the observations and the thoughts that I have on this recent issue. Let's move on from this with some more music. So coming up next from the band Tall Heights, it's Iron in the Fire. You're listening to the voice of York College, and I'll be back in 3.5 minutes. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of York College. That was Tall Heights with Iron in the Fire. I'm your host, Keelan Tollinger. So to continue off of the previous topic that was talking about discussions on race and ethnicity, there was a more relaxed, informative, but also kind of serious lecture in the Waldner Performing Arts Center this Wednesday night. It was a public service announcement here on WVYC to go and check it out. This was reflecting on York's race revolts by a longtime professor here at the college named Dr. Peter Levy. So he's an integral part of the history department here. I've never had a class with him, but instantly on like the first impression, I'd compare his like appearance to Alex Trebek, but without the glasses. At least that's what it looked like from the stage. But more to the point, I mean, this was a really well-attended event. Like the whole bottom section of the WPAC was filled with people. And the lecture by Dr. Levy was about the approaching 50th anniversary of York City's own civil rights protest. And this lecture was part of the Hidden Figures Community Engagement Series, basically exploring the sometimes undocumented history of African Americans in this region through art and activism. Now, Dr. Peter Levy had recently written a book that had been published called The Great Uprising, Race Revolts in Urban America During the 1960s. He started studying some of the periods of regional racial conflict when he learned of the story of Cambridge, Maryland, a small town south of here of about 10,000 or so, where a so-called riot broke out from the famous words of a speech by an activist named H. Rap Brown. If this town don't turn around, Cambridge ought to be burned to the ground. So, given, for instance, I mean, the incident in Baltimore, Maryland a few years ago between African Americans and police, these types of clashes are still relevant issues today to discuss. And Dr. Levy brought up some of the statistics that hint towards a disparity between whites and people of color then and now. So, like a majority of blacks, for instance, back in the 1960s, said that the protests they engaged in, particularly like here in New York, were a response to injustice and mistreatment. A majority of whites called it an excuse to cause damage. So that was back then. After Baltimore, the same trend in a Pew Research Center poll also applied, had the same results. So there's still disagreements about what these protests actually were. Now, I had no idea this incident in York had taken place when I've lived in this city for 4 years now as a student, and between like 5 and 6 as a newborn, I guess, because obviously I didn't really have an ear towards conflict, really. But so many people, I guess me included, like seem to think that during the civil rights movement, much of it was contained in the South, Alabama, Georgia, like during the mid 1900s, but there's less emphasis on what took place during the late 60s in the North. So Cambridge, Maryland's revolt was in 1967. York's took place during July of 1969. And before I get into like the history of the whole event, the lecture actually opened up with a miniature concert with two musicians. I don't remember their names, honestly, but there were 5 songs. One played piano and the other an acoustic guitar. One of them was Lean on Me by Bill Withers, a classic. Another included a chorus with the phrase I have a dream, with like both of the vocalists sort of alternating between the verse. And on the screen above them, there were pieces from a local African-American artist named Ophelia Chambliss, who will be opening an exhibit down at the Center for Community Engagement for York College's center. That place, I think, is like a newly opened establishment that I believe was like converted from what was called the Lafayette Club. It was like sort of a racially segregated organization for a long time, but that's where her art exhibit Casting Shadows is going to be in the future. So there was just a lot of like names of past politicians and public figures and locations being traded during this lecture by Dr. Levy that really made me feel as if I'm not much of a York native at all. It was kind of surreal. But on to the real history of this revolt. So from the mid to late 1960s, there was a clear and concentrated racial bias between the majority and minority during this time period. I'm talking like police brutality, common instances of German shepherds being unleashed on black youths, a housing discrimination crisis where just about all of the African-American population in York was being crammed into this small, I think it was like a 6-block area, job discrimination against blacks, which meant economic rifts and poverty. And though their community protested in front of City Hall, the efforts were just seemingly ignored and gang violence continued to escalate. And then on July 17th, 1969, that was the first day that's referred to as the conflict. 11 people were injured from rock throwing, bullet exchanges. What was the real fire starter was the murder of a York City officer. This is Henry Schad on July 18th, who was struck inside of an armored vehicle. It pierced through the hull of the vehicle. And who had done that was actually a cold case for the longest time. But the police began barricading in like black neighborhoods after that incident. There were 2 deaths from the fighting, 100 arrests, dozens of properties burned down. And then July 21st, a black woman from South Carolina was visiting York when her family's car was surrounded by white gang members. This person's name is Lily Bell Allen. And once she got out of the car screaming not to shoot, more than 100 rounds were fired at the car, and Allen was gunned down. Again, in circumstances where the killer wasn't clear. I don't think these cold cases were even like re-examined until the 2000s, because like racial tensions were so deep that nobody confessed, nobody cooperated. It took 200 members of the National Guard to come in the next day after that, and 3 days for the city to settle down. But in all, like 9 days of turmoil, a total of 60 injuries and a murder on both sides. And it's a messy story, and Dr. Levy, as he was writing this book about this incident and similar ones around the country, he was asked by colleagues, well, why peel back the scabs? Like, why still bring up old wounds? And from what I gathered, I think there's still healing conversations that need to happen. And he pointed towards the long-term issues that still need to be fixed in York, like inner-city poverty. And if a historian doesn't get to the bottom of a long-held conflict, then it just becomes a lengthy, like, he said, she said affair, only it points the finger always towards the people that are rebelling, in this case, the African-American community. And when you focus on blame, you ultimately don't examine the causes of those actions in the first place, which is injustice, unfairness, disparity. But 2 final points made during that night that I think were particularly interesting. Dr. Levy brought up that Dr. Martin Luther King condemned rioting of any form. He obviously preferred peaceful protests. Though in one quote that was brought up by Dr. King, again, those causes as to why people rebel and revolt deserve just as much condemnation. Focus on the language of the unheard, I think, was one of the keys to that whole conclusion to the lecture. And then during the question and answer section with Dr. Levy, the power of words was brought up by another professor. And he selectively used the word riot sparingly. Like, he didn't like the connotations of that word. He used rebellion even less in his book. But the words uprising, as if like a minor party raised itself higher, and revolt, like a revolution, those words found a place in his book title for their more objective meanings. Because there's something about good, faithful historical research that doesn't really try to re-examine events just to pin blame on a group. Like, what I've come to sort of respect about sociological studies of this kind is really like the ethical stance, and I especially get that from Dr. Levy's work. But all in all, well worth the attendance, and I suggest you look out for more Hidden Figure series events around your college in the future. But right now it's about 3:31, and it's time for our hourly PSA. So yeah, that gets us to about 3:32 here in the studio, and I think it's a good time to get back to the music. Coming up next is a recently released track from the artist Yoste. He specializes in releasing singles here and there. This track is called Empty. It was just released last week. You're listening to 88.1 FM WVYC, and I'll be back soon. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. That was Yoste with Empty. And I'm your host, Keelan Tellinger. So we'll make coverage of this quick about the whole State of the Union address on Tuesday night, since it's already come in and out with from the news cycle without too much debate. And it's likely with just how straightforward the whole thing was. About 80 minutes of the typical, we did this, we did that, let's work together and do this. I mean, every president basically does it. I need to give a little credit to Trump for not going off script and blaming some of the roadblocks to his progress on certain people or parties. Of some of the notable guests, there was Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, one of the moonlanders, a girl named Grace Eileen, a fighter of a form of brain disease, who Trump basically said was the inspiration for our nation's medical research to go after fighting childhood cancer from now on. Several World War II veterans, also a man named Matthew Charles, whose story is actually pretty interesting, because he was supposedly the first person released from the recently passed First Step Act, as part of like a sweeping criminal justice reform. So every couple minutes there'd be one of these accomplishments from last year being brought up, a guest in the First Lady's box to stand up and take a minute's worth of applause. But one thing that I guess sort of particularly bothers me is just how narrow and specific the media coverage can be. Like, what events garner the most headlines a day after? The article, upon article, just so many about like the small 15 seconds where Nancy Pelosi stood up and apparently smirked at Trump when he turned around to look at her, the ironic expression on her face when the president was like finished saying, embrace the balanced potential of cooperation, compromise, and the common good, and she was standing there like clapping with this expression on her face, and there's still photographs of her everywhere, just like it was like a new viral moment. And it's just so biased. Like, it's clearly skewed to just like take as much attention away from Trump and seize like an advantage of every instance a person of similar power basically mocks him. And it confuses me just how that can be that important. The few people I talked to or heard talking about the State of the Union the next day, though they didn't watch it themselves, they were just like, oh, did you see Nancy Pelosi clap? Like, all in all, it's like one of those instances where secondhand experiences of just snippets of a larger event don't even come close to portraying the full picture. And it's why we have such a problem with the media today. If there's one thing, I guess, from my classes that I could apply to listening to that entire speech, I take what I got in rhetorical theory and what I'm getting now in public speaking, and say the most prominent thing about Trump's delivery, what he lacks, is, I guess, just like eloquence, the kind of performative variety, the spice. Because I think it's maybe hard to find inspiration in President Trump's words when he really turns on the positive messaging, when he's trying. Because all the grand calls for unity and cooperation and compromise, that we're all one America, heading towards a bright future together towards the end of the address. While the messaging is hopeful, I think it has to do with like the tendency that he falls flat because it's like delivered with the same speech pattern as he does when he's talking about like condemning ISIS or praising an economic statistic. Like it doesn't change from that very, very rigid and static structure, and Trump doesn't light up when he's supposed to, doesn't quite inspire, and now when he's in front of an energetic crowd at a rally, I mean, no doubt, that gets all flipped on its head. But in front of a bunch of polite politicians and esteemed guests, there's just an emotional drain, I'd say. And there's no way that being a president can be fun, though, I mean, especially when the majority of the media is scrutinizing your every word and phrase. But when he sticks to the script, it isn't too bad. But moments like when Trump said we're pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal because of that country's citizens and their attitude towards us. The one point I remember, he just paused and deviated from the script for a second to just say they're a bad, bad regime. They've done some, and a shake of the head, bad, bad things. I just cringe a bit about his ad-libbing capabilities. His eloquence, because I need to do some more work at it too, there's no question, but everyone needs to if they want to be a reliable public speaker who can deliver statements at length without an assortment, like with on a different assortment of different topics. You need to have that eloquence, and that's what hopefully one of the lessons will be for us after this presidency, that words and the rhetoric you use basically matters. But just for that one night, though, there seemed to be at least a detachment from political parties for a little bit in that chamber. When it all matters is about a week from now when the deal for the wall is brought up again, and talk of compromise has to be put under the magnifying glass again. We could see another shutdown just 2 weeks or so after a speech about progress, which is ironic, but, not very surprising. But we are at the 3:40 mark here on In the Studio, 88.1 FM WVYC, and that's all I've got about the address and our government. I'll take a short break and return with a review of the Super Bowl with what little there is to comment on. Coming up next is Rostam with In a River here on WVYC. Stay tuned. Rostam with In a River here on 88.1 FM WVYC. Welcome back. My name is Keelan Tollinger, and it's perfect timing because it's 3:45 on the dot, time for the second weather check of the hour. But yeah, let's get the Super Bowl recap done and over with now. I thought I was going to have much more material to cover about this game, but ultimately I could just go on and on about how it almost could have been called the super boring. But yeah, 13-3 with the Patriots over the Rams. I mean, I at least saw who was going to walk away with a ring coming. I had my hopes up when Tom Brady was intercepted before I even had a chance to switch on the game with my pizza from Domino's, but only one touchdown the entire game. And I don't think the experts have a consensus about whether it was a really great defensive battle or both offenses were just lackluster. And I can believe that a young quarterback and a young coach for the Rams were part of the problem when it came to moving the ball down the field. But we also know age isn't a factor when it comes to effectiveness of a player like Tom Brady in his passing. So I think it was just one big cancellation of each other. And we'll probably see both the teams again in the playoffs next year, but here's hoping they take some more risks to make things more exciting. And now, before I get on to the commercials, I suppose we can give the halftime show a bit of attention as well. It was a safe band choice in Maroon 5. I mean, nobody really wanted to perform for the Super Bowl anyway with the amount of criticism the NFL still gets about Kaepernick and the social issues surrounding it all. But one point that I heard, and I'd like to repeat, is basically the halftime performance is all about the spectacle. Not so much about how the band is doing. And the flashy lights, the technological displays were plentiful and well coordinated. The drones in the sky spelling out "One Love" or something was a neat trick. The planning, though, the choreography of it all, I guess, is what stood out the most because, I mean, they managed to drive a convertible up to the stage for the one rapper. I think his name was Big Boy. And with the other performer, Travis Scott. In contrast, I don't know if I was supposed to laugh a little, but the parts where the audio was just muted for a second or two to me were just like obvious, oh, can't put that on TV language. And that showed, well, you could try to appeal to some people, but not necessarily everyone. And the part that got most of the debate from that halftime show was the fact that there were internet goers trying to get a famous moment from SpongeBob SquarePants inside the performance. Every kid's favorite 1 minute rock anthem, the Sweet Victory song. Even though the petitions poured in for someone to implement that into the show, there were like 1.2 million signatures on a Change.org campaign. And I don't even know if it was supposed to be Maroon 5 singing it, or CBS would just politely ask Nickelodeon if they could run a few seconds of the cartoon over the live video. But though like news articles were saying that the classic was coming, all we got were like 3 seconds of Squidward in a band director costume introducing a computer-generated meteor as it like fell to Earth over Atlanta. And all it did was cue Travis Scott to do a different song. But on one hand, I'm confused, like maybe a little bit puzzled, but the more skeptical side of me thinks that, yeah, like the production team couldn't have pieced together something original, and neither could have the animators, when the effort was coming together only like a week leading up to the event. But if there's one positive to take away, is that the song Sweet Victory got over a 500% listening increase online thanks to all the publicity. And I'm sure more hardcore fans would have wanted a more heartfelt tribute when SpongeBob's creator passed away, Steven Hillenburg. That was last year. But what the media owners, can't do, the supporters can do easier, and that's survive the memory. But to finish up on our run-through of the most notable Super Bowl ads, the only one that I can see as an all-around dislike is that TurboTax commercial with the Robo-Child, the creepy doll face that couldn't display emotions properly. Yeah, that's probably reinstalling people's fears about artificial intelligence for sure. One of the ones that fell flat with a lot of consumers, it seems, was the one for Burger King featuring the late popular artist Andy Warhol. It was a very minimalist 45-second spot where he just unwraps a Whopper, struggles to get some of the Heinz ketchup out of a glass bottle, and dips in his sandwich, all quaint and delicate. I didn't know until the hashtag came up over the footage, Eat Like Andy, that it was Warhol, and I can only guess that the millions of other younger viewers kind of blinked and scratched their heads and might not even have guessed who he was. The recording came from some kind of documentary where Warhol just eats in silence for a few minutes, and Burger King only used it for the packaging placement, the old logo from decades past, but it does maybe feel a bit unsettling, kind of like the Robo-Child, to have a deceased spokesperson that wouldn't have known he was being used. I'm not sure, but to the more positive ones. I enjoyed the failed Alexa products, like the dog collar that understands dogs, the toothbrush speaker, and the Alexa that kept turning the lights on and off across the country. I thought it was a pretty decent effort that Amazon could poke fun at itself. Plus, they brought in Harrison Ford. The Washington Post Democracy Dies in Darkness advertisement with photos of lost journalists, including Jamal Khashoggi, quite powerful. But ironically enough, for how much this organization, I think, takes a lot of negative press, I'd give my number one to the NFL's 100-year game commercial. It's like all sorts of the best players appearing in suits for this gala that turns into a giant scramble for a golden football. The faces, the coordination, just a number of stunts of people flying into tables and pretending to tackle each other at high speed. Joe Montana throwing to Jerry Rice, Tom Brady asking someone, I don't quite know his name honestly, but just telling him to hold his 5 jeweled Super Bowl rings so he can get out there and join the party. Saquon Barkley, even at the very end, the old Penn State running back. Only a rookie, and important enough that he can be filmed leaping over a tackler while wearing a dress suit. Just great fun. It was a shining example of how to get the sport-watching public back on your side. But that's about all I've got on the Super Bowl, and the last we'll be talking about professional football in a while. But back to the music with this final track from Beach Fossils. Here is their song, Sugar. I'll be back in 3 minutes to close out the hour here on WVYC. Stay tuned.
1, 2, 3.
Beach Fossils with Sugar here on 88.1 FM WVYC. And to close out the hour here on In the Studio, I've got a small final story that you might find entertaining before I sign off. So McDonald's has lost their European trademark for the Big Mac. They don't own the phrase anymore, so Burger Kings in Europe took that as an opportunity to make fun of the competitor's sandwich on their menus. So you can order combos like a Big Mac but actually big, burger that Big Mac wished it was, Big Mac-ish, but flame-grilled, of course, and the anything but a Big Mac. Like, these are real, just like joke entries that they have over the counters just to pour salt in the wounds. When these menu items are on electronic screens, the names change over to the real items on occasion afterwards, so I think you actually know what you're trying to order at the very least. But how this all happened was that McDonald's was trying to go after an Irish restaurant chain called Supermacs. They've been in business since 1978, this one chain, about 100 different restaurants, but McDonald's thought that Supermacs infringes on the Big Mac name. Turns out it doesn't, so they lost the case, and with it, somehow, I guess as punishment or consequence, every franchise in the European Union can use the Big Mac name without repercussions. Is it a good move for Burger King to change their menu items just to make fun of McDonald's? I'll leave that opinion up to you. But that'll about do it for me in the studio for this week. Covered some issues around YCP and the nation abroad today, and I'm very thankful you could join me. But check out the archive channel by going online to youtube.com and searching In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger to get all of the monologuing of mine without the music for your re-listening needs. And check back in next week for a story about the Facebook research app that was recently canned from the Apple App Store. And hope to catch you here next week, same day, same hour, here on The Voice of Your College. We will end things off with Rivers and their song The Reach. Have a good weekend, everybody.